Yeah, hey there. Welcome, everyone. A very warm welcome wherever you are. And we trust that you are safe and sane, and welcome to the Pipeline Riots. We want to talk about strategies and tactics in the struggle against fossil capital, but also about the material conditions of this struggle. So please welcome our guests, Andreas Malm and Joshua Clover. We're delighted to have you. And we're also very excited about having this discussion and also having the opportunity to share it with friends and comrades everywhere. And yeah, many thanks to the organizers, to Frank Engster and the Helle Panke in Berlin. And also, of course, to my co-moderator, Ines Schwerdtner, who you may know, of course, because she's the editor-in-chief of Jacobin Magazin, Germany. My name is Dennis, and I happen to co-translate Joshua's book. I also want to briefly mention Jan Heinz, another translator of the book, who will help us keep track maybe of the audience questions in the chat. And yeah, so that said, happy to have you, and Ines.
Yeah, hello from me too. I'm sitting in this Helle Panke office in Berlin right now. It's totally empty because it's still Corona time, and so we're all alone sitting in our rooms, only meeting us online, but we're happy to have you. Yeah, as you can see, I'm in the Helle Panke office, and I'm also welcoming you too, Joshua and Andreas, because I mean, obviously we have enough reasons to talk, but your books, your latest books have been published in German recently, and I'm just going to hold them up because they also look really nice, and you should get them after the talk, because bookstores in Berlin are still open. I hope in your places too. This is a good thing. So this is the one from Joshua, or by Joshua. This is called Riot, Strike, Riot. It's the same title in German, published by Galerie der abseitigen Künste. So you can get this one. It was published by Verso in 2019, and now it's really recent in German. And two books by Andreas in this, from the same publisher, Matthes Seitz. So we've got, I think this is a great title actually in German. It's called Klima or Klimax, which is like a really smart title for his book. But the English original is a little bit different. It's called Corona, Climate and Chronic Emergency, also by Verso. And here we've got How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is also, I mean, something about political violence that we're going to talk about tonight. And in German, it's called Wie man eine Pipeline in die Luft jagt. So go get them. They're like substantial reads. But yeah, for tonight, we're thinking that both Joshua and Andreas will have like a short introduction just to give you like a brief summary of not just their books, but their general thoughts. And after that, we will have some questions like Dennis and I. And maybe after like an hour when we have finished all we had to talk about, we're happy for your questions, or we're looking forward to your questions and comments, which you can put in a chat. We cannot see you or hear you. You can just write them down in a chat. Don't write too much, because otherwise it will get too confusing. So try and focus on what you really want to know, and we will try to pick them up. And also we have a German translator, Isolde McLiam. Thank you, Isolde, for translating for us. Because we have lost the second translator, you will be the only one tonight, which is a huge task for you, and we're thankful. And so I asked Joshua and Andreas to speak slowly so that she can translate. And if at some point after 1 hour or 90 minutes, she feels too tired because we are talking about doom and catastrophes and political violence, then she will just say, I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore. And yeah, we will have to deal with that. But everything will be recorded. Maybe we will use some subtitles after that. So everyone who only speaks German and not English can then also watch it afterwards. So this is it from me. And we'll just hand it over to you, Joshua and Andreas, to start with your introduction. I think Joshua goes first.
Thank you very much. I know by habit I'm a bit of a fast talker, but I really want to respect Isolde's work here, so I'm going to do my best to go slowly. And if I start to get excited and speed up, somebody will wave their hands or gesticulate, or Isolde will message me, and I'll try to slow down. I want to thank everyone, of course, especially our hosts, Ines, Dennis, Isolde, Frank. Special thanks to Karl-Heinz, to Andreas for sharing this with me, and of course, as always, thanks to Rosa herself. In the middle of the last century, Aimé Césaire offered that bourgeois society had given rise to two problems that it cannot solve: the problem of the proletariat and the colonial problem. I think this is still true regarding the entangled and foundational modes of subjugation. To that pair, I might add what I will call the two constraints, barely if at all surmised in 1950, which now form the absolute limits within which we confront the two problems. These are the end of growth and planetary climate collapse. Arresting or even reversing these phenomena would not itself be intrinsically emancipatory. And yet they constrain dramatically how we might confront the two problems and how swiftly we must in the struggle for communal life and flourishing for humans and others. This is the history of our thinking. The period from about 1820 to 1970 is defined by unparalleled, if uneven, capitalist vitality, accumulation at a global scale previously unimaginable. And this is the span, more or less, that separates the crucial moments orienting Andreas's Fossil Capital from Riot, Strike, Riot, respectively. The former book capturing the engineered shift from water power to steam, its wholesale reorganization of labor processes, and the latter inquiring about capital's waning capacity to internalize labor inputs productively as its requisite expansion comes to an end. Both of these changes reorganize political life as well, including the tactics that present themselves to social struggles, which is why the orienting tactics of such movements in the early industrializing nations shift around the first state and shift again around the second. Now, I want to note a peculiar fact, which is that while pipeline sabotage has been around as long as pipelines, their blockade and destruction really come of age, at least in North America, in the early 1970s, at almost exactly the moment when global capitalism slows to a crawl and becomes more vulnerable to attacks on its vital planetary infrastructure, even as it requires cheap extraction ever more desperately. This is one of the ways that I understand how to blow up a pipeline. It is also the core content of the new book I am working on about revolutionary struggle in the present, and particularly the form of the commune. What are survival tactics, or political violence if you must, after the end of growth and before the end of planetary habitability? To start with, they are driven to take the form of what I have called circulation struggles. As global production has slowed, the circulation of commodities, most especially fossil fuels, has quickened. These vast infrastructural build-outs, for which pipelines are the great example, are vulnerable. Unlike, for example, the assembly line in a computer or an auto fab, vulnerable to those who do not necessarily work there. A British Petroleum employee could blow up a pipeline, but so could I. Finally, true equality. I think this is shared terrain for both of us, but I must make a final divergence in the form of a confession. I'm a bit envious of Andreas's work. Not just his insight and clarity, but his willingness to suggest what we ought to do next. He has, I think, some vital prescriptions, though I know we are all hoping the new book would maybe have some more diagrams and explanations, but perhaps he can fill us in. In this regard, however, I have worked in a somewhat different tradition. I understand historical materialism to avoid prescription. It is at best predictive. That is to say, I think this tradition provides us a clear account of why the riot returns and why the circulation struggle more broadly, the pipeline riot, why this is certain to be the core shape for political antagonism for quite some time. Not because it is good or bad, it's good. not because it will work or not, let's hope, but because the real restructurings of class, capital, colonization, and climate put such tactics on offer and indeed make them inevitable. With that, I'd like to pass things to Andreas, and then from there, we'll move to questions, I guess.
All right, thank you, Joshua, and thanks to all the comrades who have made this meeting possible. Now, what I will offer here is not a summary of the pipeline book, but more of a sort of postscript to it. I wrote that book towards the end of 2019, and that year was, it feels like an eon ago, but that year really was the moment when the climate movement reached its historical peak so far in terms of mass mobilization on the streets. And after that, we had the pandemic breaking out, and the movement just completely fell off a cliff. What we had in 2020 was another social movement that grabbed the headlines and shook up things in the global north. And that, of course, was the movement for Black Lives, or BLM. And I've been banging on about this in interviews I've made since my pipeline book came out. So apologies if some of you have seen or heard me say similar things elsewhere. Now, the BLM uprising after the murder of George Floyd fits perfectly into the analytical model developed by Joshua in his wonderful book. But how does it fit into thinking about strategies for the climate movement? Well, the predominant, the quite completely hegemonic way of thinking about the climate movement and its strategies so far has been strategic pacifism, propounded by people like Bill McKibben and Extinction Rebellion, not the least. And strategic pacifism is the idea that as soon as you step away from absolutely peaceful civil disobedience and engage in any kind of violence, you lose popular support, you alienate the masses, and you condemn yourself to marginalization. And the strategic pacifists use a lot of historical cases to substantiate this thesis. I tried to rebut the interpretation that they offer of all of these events, although very briefly in my book. But really, a climate movement that searches for useful lessons and analogies doesn't need to study social movements that existed decades or even centuries ago. It can start by looking at what happened in 2020. And we all, of course, remember the murder of George Floyd, this last incident of a ghastly murder of Black people at the hands of the US police, in this endless chain of atrocities, and how it sparked an uprising. And the key moment of that uprising that really constituted it was the storming and burning down of the police station in Minneapolis, 3rd Precinct. Now, exactly contrary to strategic pacifism, this early confrontation with the cops in Minneapolis and the destruction of their property served as a catalyst for what might have been the largest mass movement in US history, measured by the number of participants in demonstrations, somewhere between 15 and 30 million people. And polls, as you might have seen, indicated that a majority of Americans supported this first key act of property destruction. And more particularly, and this is a lesson that we need to consider from a climate perspective, I think, the storming demonstrated that the institution of the police does not stand above everyone else. It's not beyond the influence of people. The systematic violence against African Americans is not an inexorable fate. It can be stopped literally, physically, as in taking out the properties from which the cops operate. So the storming of that police station in the 3rd Precinct broke a certain paralysis. It didn't scare off people. To the contrary, it rallied them to the cause like never before, because it was now clear that mass action could overwhelm the killer cops. And what followed, of course, was a wave of demonstrations, the bulk of which was entirely peaceful, again, contrary to strategic pacifism. The militant actions of radical flanks inspired a mass movement that was predominantly nonviolent. And just as there was a racial diversity in the movement for Black lives, far greater, it bears pointing out, than in the climate movement so far in the global north, so there was a diversity of tactics. And this diversity was never without friction or tension, that's part of the picture, but from Minneapolis to Kenosha and Portland and beyond, there was a spectrum of activism ranging from the most tranquil vigils and serene marches to the toppling of statues and smashing of windows and street fighting with the cops. And I don't see how anyone could persuasively argue that BLM would have achieved more in 2020 had it exclusively stayed with the totally peaceful kind of activism, which is the choice that the climate movement has made so far in the global north, with few exceptions. To me, it's fairly obvious that without the confrontational edge, the BLM movement wouldn't have broken through the stalemate and lifted the anti-racist struggle to another scale as it did. What should the climate movement learn from this? Well, we will never have an incident like the murder of George Floyd. We won't have an 8-minute film sequence capturing how a fossil fuel executive chokes a farmer in Mozambique or a fisherman in the Philippines to death. The violence of fossil capital is not directly interpersonal. It is mediated through the atmosphere. It is a structural and constant violence ever on the rise. And I really believe it is a form of violence because it's a systematic destruction of lives, incidentally the lives of people of color first and foremost, but eventually, if it continues, to the end potentially of all human life. The glacier that fell off into a dam in northern India the other day and sent a torrent of water and mud and stone crashing through a valley and instantly killed some 200 people came not from a concentrated act of immediate violence like what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd. It came as a result of the totality of emissions, the entirety, the aggregate sum, the cumulative effect of emissions made over 2 centuries. So there is limited potential for the same sudden outrage, or is there? Well, while we don't have and won't have the equivalent film clip, we know for a certainty that we will have 2 other things. First, we'll have more climate disasters. There will be more and worse hurricanes, wildfires, floods, droughts, storm surges, glacier lake outburst floods, and all the rest, as in the past few years, but more intense, frequent, and cataclysmic. Second, we know that there will be more instances of expanded fossil fuel infrastructure. In Western Europe, the past year has given us a green light for a 3rd runway at Heathrow and a new deep coal mine in Cumbria, the inauguration of a new mega airport in Berlin and a fresh coal-fired power plant in North Rhine-Westphalia, the expansion of the Autobahn and tearing down of an old-growth forest in Hessen. And now Total, the single largest private corporation in France, is about to get funding from Emmanuel Macron to go drilling for more gas in the Arctic. And on it goes. Might there be some potential for outrage here? It shouldn't be ruled out, I think, particularly if the link can be made between the actual disasters and the accelerated drivers. Imagine the news is filled with a catastrophic hurricane in the Caribbean while construction on the 3rd runway at Heathrow is about to start. Or that another extreme heat wave in France coincides with fresh investments of Total in the Arctic. Any such combination could be a moment for the climate movement to storm its 3rd precinct. And I strongly believe that we have to learn to act in the moments when climate breakdown hits home, even if it be far away, as in destroying the lives of multitudes in the global south. So far, the climate movement we've scheduled our actions for certain Fridays or action days or the dates of UN climate summits, but we need to move beyond such mechanical calendars and strike in the moments of disaster when the violence of fossil fuel combustion become apparent. So imagine that some people had responded to the Australian wildfire inferno a year ago by storming a coal facility in that country and destroying it. That might potentially have contributed to breaking some paralysis. But so far, all disasters of this kind have come and gone without our movement concretely politicizing them in the moment of heat. Now, am I 5 minutes up? They are, yeah? Yeah. So I will just end by saying that I think that on the climate front, rage will erupt only when the climate movement gets ready to articulate the rage and stops being so timid. And that means getting rid of our pacifist superego. And this is not, I mean, this doesn't solve the issues of strategy concerning state and party and union and all the rest. I think we can discuss this for the past, for the coming 1.5 hour or what's left of this meeting. This is just my way of departing from a baseline of immense frustration with the inertia of business as usual. Yes.
Excellent. Many thanks to both of you. That was rich, dense, and lively. I'm looking forward to going deeper into this. There are already some questions in the chat, which again, we are monitoring, right? And we'll be able to ask them later, but not all of them. But please keep writing your questions in the chat, right? We will try to take care of them. And again, many thanks. I have right to now shift to the next part of our event. I have really a long question, but it's intended to just open the space for the debate. So I want to say that in the face of, we mentioned it, global capitalism's long, uneven, manifold, and pandemic-fueled crisis, as well as the state of the real movement, so-called, that seeks to abolish the present state of things. We may ask, right, have we transitioned from the famous socialism or barbarism to communism or doom? And what would it mean to take the Gilets jaunes popular rallying cry seriously after all? The one that goes, end of the world, end of the month, it's the same struggle. That is to say, if economic precarity and climate breakdown are connected at the root, shouldn't we dig for our lives as fast as we can to preserve the possibility, at least, of communal life and collective emancipation? Well, yeah, but how? And of course, we want to talk about strategies and tactics, as I said before, in the struggle specifically against fossil capital, but also ask what are the material conditions of this struggle, regardless of perspective, such as, well, the question, what about the long crisis of accumulation since the 1970s, recomposition of the working class and planetary growth of relative surplus populations, both in the peripheries and the capitalist core, extreme climate events and zoonotic spillovers too, right? And we look forward to hearing your takes and analyses, the role of the state and political reaction, the role of militancy, of course, in what gets called political violence, the notion of violence itself, the riot as a form of social struggle, and the centrality of fossil infrastructure, including oil and gas pipelines. But also this, what lessons can be learned from the different but related ecological and class struggles on both sides of the Atlantic? That would be my framing question for you.
Okay, Joshua is asking me to go first here. But I mean, these questions are so big that I don't really know exactly where to start, to be honest.
Do you want a specific one?
Maybe that's, yeah, maybe, why not?
So regarding your most recent book and this wonderful political intervention, right? How to blow up a pipeline. Would it be fair to say, Andreas, that your argument about strategy and tactics in the book essentially rests upon, and you mentioned it in your introduction, a clarifying historical and political analysis of what you call the radical flank effect, or what gets frequently called radical flank effect, and of which, for instance, the suffragettes, but also the civil rights movement in the States, but also the struggle against apartheid are the most well-known and successful examples. And if, right, question is yes, the answer to the question is yes, and I share your hope of catalyzing this kind of radical flank effect also for the climate movement, hopefully. Where does that leave us with regard to the other fundamental insight of your work in general, namely that the struggle against the infrastructure and also dynamic of fossil capital is very different in kind, or maybe different in kind, from the struggle for democratic rights and against apartheid or dictatorships. So in other words, if what we are facing is no less than, and this is a quotation from the book, the material form of global capitalism, right? How do we blow it up without blowing ourselves up? What kind of proletarian explosion would maybe enable a radical social transformation rather than some kind of generalized, latent, or open civil war?
Yeah, okay, thanks for this. So, a question that is hinted at here, and one that I don't deal with to the extent that it really deserves, because it's really the big one, and it's the same with the Corona book. It's the same problem there. That is the relation between the states that we have and social movements. But I think I touch upon it in the book, and my argument in the book is not that we in the climate movement should go out and blow all fossil fuel infrastructure into the air. I mean, honestly, we don't have the armies to do that. We haven't even started blowing up pipelines. So the idea that we should go out and take the entire infrastructure down would be just presumptuous, you know what I mean? But I mean, sometimes when you go to climate camps and on other forums like that, you encounter people who seem to seriously think that direct action will be the method by which the transition happens. As in, you're going to have proliferating climate camps all over the place and shut down all fossil fuel infrastructure by such means. And that will take us away from fossil fuels and into a world economy without fossil fuels. I don't really share that view. I think that at the end of the day, there is no other agent in our societies that can execute the transition except for states. The states that we have are dreary and awful, and we would like them to be very different. We'd like them to be worker states or communes or council structures or whatever. But the view that I usually take on these things is that we are extremely short of time when it comes to avoiding spiraling global heating. And it's a very tall order to formulate it this way. We first need to dismantle the existing states and then replace them with some sort of socialist organizations, and then address the climate crisis. I think we need to think about this process the other way around. So sabotage and any other kind of radical flank tactic, as I imagine it, and this might only be in my imagination, but I'll stay with it for the time being. The function of that radical flank would be to amplify, to step up the pressure against states to do what is necessary. And again, if we look at the BLM movement, I mean, you've had certain concessions made by various levels of the US state apparatus to the BLM movement, as in reducing funding to police in Austin, Texas, or initiatives to defund it in LA, and talk about abolishing it completely in Minneapolis and those things. And I really believe that those concessions became possible and necessary because the existence of a radical flank in dialectic with the broader mass movement. And what we need with climate is something similar. Now in Germany, which is the powerhouse and the key country in Europe when it comes to the transition, we've had an effect of a similar kind, because Ende Gelände was absolutely essential in pushing the issue of the lignite mines to the point where you had the coal phase out commission, which of course came out with the absolutely unacceptable date of 2038 for a phase out. And that's why Ende Gelände will continue, and that's why the movement has to continue. But I think that the next time we get into that moment of compelling the German state, or any other state for that matter, to negotiate with us, we need another balance of forces where we are stronger, and the movement larger by an order of magnitude or more than it was in 2019. And I think that will have to include a component of more militant tactics as well. So what I'm trying to outline here is not a perspective of the radical flank solving this problem by its own efforts, as in blowing the whole infrastructure up, because I don't see that as a path forward, but to be part of a dynamic process in an antagonistic relation with a state, where we from outside of the state try to compel it to do what has to be done. And there are, of course, I mean, there are other examples where you can study this at a smaller scale. So the Danish government, for instance, just recently made a decision that seems extremely, I mean, it's really a minimum demand. But what they decided was that we're going to cancel all licensing of further rounds of drilling in our part of the North Sea. And Denmark is the largest oil and gas producer in the EU. So it's still very small compared to the UK or Norway now outside of the EU, but it's still fairly significant. And the reason the Danish government did this was that election where Social Democrats came to power, and they are awful. The Danish Social Democrats are awful. I mean, yeah, I could trash talk them for a long time, but the point I want to make here is that the popular mobilizations in Denmark pushed the state under the leadership of Social Democrats to make this decision of actually terminating capital accumulation in the oil and gas fields of Denmark in the long run. They're not saying we're closing down existing oil and gas fields, which would be revolutionary. They will run until they're depleted, but they're saying we're not going to open any new ones. And that is a kind of limit to capital accumulation. And it's the limit that we need, and it has to be much sharper and radicalized. I mean, we need to shut down existing fields. But this shows that a dynamic relation between popular movements and states is not impossible in the sphere of climate politics, I believe. But there are problems with this perspective because it's inherently reformist, you can argue. I would counter by saying what you would set in motion would be a logic of transitional demands that might go beyond the capitalist status quo and set in motion processes that might lead beyond bourgeois states and our current capitalist economies. But we can get back to that later.
Just briefly, many thanks, Andreas. Directly in relation to what you just said, when I said latent or open civil war, I had the state in mind in particular, right, with regard to ramping up repression of those movements, right? Once you see that kind of militancy and the radical flank in relation to and in interaction, in dynamical interaction with, right, the democratic mass movement, social movement, which is nonviolent, right, then that would also be the moment where we see intense state repression and ruthless, right, brutal repression that we already see in many places.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can be nonviolent and still trigger this kind of repression. I mean, just look at what XR is facing in the UK right now, where the government is just freaking out about XR. Yeah. I think we need to count on repression. No social movement has made progress in history without struggling with the problem of repression. The idea that the climate movement should choose the tactics that allow us to avoid repression is just, that's not how social change operates. Of course we'll face repression.
Many thanks. Ines, maybe? Or Joshua directly in response?
I'm happy to respond. And I mean, I think that something about the structure of Zoom discussions leads us toward the category of debate. And I think at a deep level, Andreas and I largely agree on most fundamental things, and certainly on the inevitability and necessity understood in different ways of the modes of struggle that he's politely calling the radical flank, and that we could also call political violence. On this, we agree. I think I'm less confident about that sort of theory of change offered involving the state for a couple of reasons that I would suggest. Andreas said we're extremely short of time, and I think I want to underscore that like nothing is of greater significance than that fact. And when I hold that fact in mind and look at the history of states and dramatic change, it's very hard to reconcile the idea that one should work through the state if one is in a big hurry. The experience of states, particularly liberal democratic states of the last 200 years, is that they move incredibly slowly. If we look at the progress developed by currently existing sort of forms of pressure organization, the rate at which it happens literally guarantees that a climate project or any other emancipatory project that desires to operate fundamentally, even if by quite dramatic actions like blowing up pipelines, or for that matter, burning down police stations, if it means to operate, to think of those as fundamentally within the category of pressure politics to convince state operators to transform policies, the end game of that is glub, glub, glub. We will all be underwater before any significant change happens. There's a really telling moment in Andreas's pipeline book, right? Where there's that wonderful opening account. And I really hope everyone will read this book, because in some ways it responds to questions that are being asked in the chat about, well, how do you do this, right? And it tries to think that question. It's very serious. But there's an opening story about, various people who undertake this project of rendering inoperable the SUVs in their city and disarming them, as it says, and how that was a brief but optimistic or a moment of possibility, and sort of showed a potential way forward. And then he concedes that it sort of ran out of steam. And the thing that happened, right, is that everyone who was doing that turned toward the COP15 negotiations, and that particular movement to disarm SUVs ended and never returned. That is a beautiful illustration of reality, not wishful thinking, right, in which the shift toward policy concerns utterly demobilizes a powerful social movement, and even one that's prepared to use quite ambitious tactics in its own behalf, and how that engagement with policy struggles is a form of demobilization and weakening and indeed recuperation of the movement. So I think we have all this evidence, right, that substantial dramatic shifts in the way we organize our lives, if we want to use those terms like mode of production or whatever, don't happen through the long arc of policy intervention. They happen very quickly in much more dramatic moments. And I would suggest, following much the same line as Andreas, that because time is so short, imagining that we're going to transform the current state towards survival is counter to everything available to us in our historical knowledge, and that it's clear that a strategy that will move more swiftly is required of us. So I think we do end up in different places, and that I think it's interesting that in his introduction, he talked about the need to overcome the pacifist superego. Like, again, something I agree with completely. I think using psychoanalytic language is always a double-edged sword, right? But it's a useful formulation, right? It's clear that needs to be shrugged off. What I think is unclear, if we stay within that sort of metaphoric of the psychoanalytic framework, is how or why we would then successfully apply a different superego, right? Something like a social democratic superego that would organize that violence perfectly, coherently, limit it so that it did a specific kind of pressure politics, only oriented toward the state. I think that if you're going to shrug off a superego, just again, to stay in that metaphoric space, and give the id of political violence free play, you can't then say, but only do it this way because this way is cool. You know, Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front, they're too much id. We want to bring the superego back in to stop that from happening. And I don't think that's how that structure works, to be honest. I agree the superego has to go, but I think we have to reckon with what that tells us about how the misery experienced by billions of people across the planet is going to get expressed, rather than just immediately trying to marshal it for our own political project.
So we got lots of questions already. It's really hard to follow everything, and I'm sure we cannot address them all, but we will try, definitely. I was going to ask one question that relates to what you've just said about the role of the state, because Andreas, you have coined the term that was widely discussed in German media of eco-Leninism. And just referring to Lenin is something that you just don't do, apparently. And maybe you could elaborate on what you mean by that, because it refers to what you just said about how we take the state, or how we kind of use the state, and also about the right historical time. Like, you cannot plan these things, as you said. And Lenin just realized, okay, there's a world war going on, and there's like a catastrophe. We have to act now. And with climate change, this is kind of different. There's not this like one big catastrophe, and you just, how do you mobilize the masses for something like that? So maybe you can elaborate on that, how you find the right moment. Is it like a fire in Australia? How does that mobilize people in Europe, for example, or something? Or can it only happen in this particular time? And then also, and I know this makes the question bigger, but I want also Joshua to expand on his criticism about how, I mean, how do you see movements that orient towards elections, like Bernie Sanders and also Jeremy Corbyn? I mean, they promised a Green New Deal, or they promised this kind of reformist way of channeling some of the social movements that were going on into some kind of program that could maybe give us a little bit of time, at least, to, you know, well, do something about climate change. And yeah, how do you view those strategies? I mean, I guess Joshua is more critical than Andreas, but yeah, we wanted to ask you if a green industrial revolution as a left-wing project is anything you would want strategically. Can that be combined with what you just said?
You want me to start?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so on the notion of ecological Leninism, I have to confess here that the way that idea made it into print was the following. I was sitting in Berlin in April during the lockdown and speed writing this little pamphlet or intervention on the corona crisis. And I think I spent something like 4 or 5 days writing on ecological Leninism and war communism as possible ideas for this moment. So what I provide in that book is an extremely rough and crude and unfinished sketch of what this might mean. I'm happy to say that other comrades are working in the same vein, thinking about Lenin and Leninism as possible sources of inspiration for our strategies in the climate struggle. So I think there will be more conversations about this coming collectively, and I will try to contribute by elaborating on what I sketched very crudely in that book. Now, what the core idea of ecological Leninism as I presented in the book is very simple, and that's, as you mentioned, it's an analogy with the situation during the First World War, when Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and the others who parted ways with the Second International said that this catastrophe has to be transformed into a political crisis where we topple the dominant classes that keep the catastrophe going. So a crisis of symptoms must be transformed into a crisis of the drivers. And if we are now in a chronic emergency where we see one disaster after another coming towards us, and here I really want to stress that we should understand the pandemic as a symptom of the ecological crisis, then our strategic orientation must be precisely this one, to try to use every instance of a crisis of the symptoms and transform it into a crisis of the drivers. Now, all progressive forces, the climate movement, its allies, everyone, have failed miserably in the pandemic because there has been no initiatives anywhere, as far as I know, of going after the drivers of pandemics and zoonotic spillover and rising infectious diseases in our world today. So there are no initiatives related to the pandemic to address deforestation, which is the key driver, or wildlife trading. It's all about fighting the symptoms. We were slightly more successful in turning the crisis of symptoms in 2018, the summer of 2018 in Europe. All Europeans remember that summer when we had an unprecedented heat wave and drought and wildfires in Northern and Central Europe, which gave rise to Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, and the wave of mobilizations that happened in 2019 that focused on the drivers was largely an outcome of that summer. So that's in line with the strategic orientation, very broadly speaking, of ecological Leninism. It's just that I think that going after the drivers will have to be done in a more radical fashion than what happened in 2019. And what is the right, Ines is asking the key question, what is the right moment to do this? Well, that's very hard to tell. What kind of spark can set off that sort of conflagration, that sort of fire that you can turn into an assault on the drivers? What we know is that we'll have more climate disasters, but the climate movement really should discuss, I think, internally, how to prepare ourselves for those moments of impact, how to save certain tactical initiatives to those moments and be ready to strike when the iron is hot, so to speak. And I hope there is a lot of discussion about this, maybe already ongoing inside various climate movements in the global north. Now, the question of the Green New Deal was primarily addressed to Joshua, but let me just say briefly that I would love to see someone like Bernie Sanders rule the US or Jeremy Corbyn the UK. And, you know, in an alternative universe, an alternative history, these two men would have led those countries now. And I think we then would have been in a completely different political situation than what we are with Biden and Johnson. And I think that it would be rash to say from a kind of left perspective that the Green New Deal was a doomed project because Bernie Sanders didn't win, or the Green Industrial Revolution was you know, destined to fail because Corbyn didn't win the elections. I mean, these two projects were not stillborn from the beginning. They had some real momentum, and they came within reasonable distance of actually winning. And it's not like we who are further to the left have come up with a better recipe for winning majority support. And I think that the Green New Deal and similar projects have traction and a political potential by aligning themselves with very important material class demands that go beyond the figures of Sanders and Corbyn. So I would not be the one to write those projects off. I was thinking that I should respond to some of the points made by Joshua in his latest interventions, but I'll save that for later.
A quick question for you, Andreas, just directly in relation. Would you agree that Sanders was essentially defeated by the DNC?
Yeah.
Because otherwise I totally agree, but that seems to be a major problem, right?
Sure.
For later, maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not up to date with these discussions, but I'm sure that in the DSA and other parts of the left in the US, there is a discussion about strategy after Sanders. Are we done with the Democratic Party? Do we try something completely different? And likewise in the UK, is this the end of all ideas of transforming Labour into a progressive force? And do we go back to left formations to the outside of these parties? And I'm totally open for those conclusions to leave the Democratic Party and Labour to their neoliberal shameful fate and go for other political formations. But I still think that the core ideas of the Green New Deal or the Green Industrial Revolution, where you try to combine a rebalancing of class forces in society with the transition away from fossil fuels, this has still political potential and hasn't lost any of its importance. To the contrary.
Great, many thanks.
I think it's become clear that the carefully prepared questions and plans of Ines and Dennis are going to fall by the wayside as Andreas and I go back and forth. But that's because these are vital issues, right? I think we're already at sort of the heart of how to find a way forward where we survive, and that's really important. I want to try and speak to these because they're vital questions. So I want to talk for a moment about Sanders and Corbyn and about the Green New Deal. And maybe I'll get there by way of Lenin, since everything passes through Lenin sooner or later. Right, you know, I don't think of myself as an anti-Leninist in any regard, and I absolutely think of myself as a communist to the core. But you know, I think back to that moment of Lenin, often sort of presented in these heroic images, like on a mountainside, right? Saying, you know, that communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. And there's something resonant about that in that moment, that sense of like expansive, productivist, we're going to have more and more capacity, more and more energy, and we're going to build communism with that. That's not the current situation we're in, as we all know entirely well. The question is how to build communism with less and less energy, less and less production, right? And this is not just because it's in some sense desirable. Like I don't mean to start an argument about degrowth or anti-civ politics or any of that, because I'm not arguing for an ethics here of desirability. There is going to be no more growth within capitalism. Like there will be no green industrial revolution, because an industrial revolution is defined by massive capacity for growth and massive absorption of inputs and massive output. And that produces jobs, right? And we're still in a situation where people have to have jobs to eat. The economic transformation whereby there's a bunch of growth that produces jobs for the growing surplus population of the planet who don't have jobs and struggle to find out how they're going to survive each week is not going to happen. And that's what I mean by it being one of the two constraints, right? The end of growth. It's a real constraint to how we consider our political fate and our political options and our political strategies and tactics. And strategies and tactics that do not take that into account, the impossibility of capitalist growth and expansion and growing labor internalization, are dead in the water. So I want to encourage us to think about ways forward that don't require an imagination of that kind of capitalist expansion and capitalist growth. And if we have some social democratic governments in Europe, although it's not heading that way, or in the United States, if Sanders and Corbyn had won, that would still be the case. I agree. The argument against these paths is not that Sanders and Corbyn lost. Andreas is completely right about that fact. It's that even had they won, the constraints of capitalism, right, the material, real conditions of our lives remain in place. And so we have to sort of think about other possible ways forward. This is why, to go back to where our conversation began in some sense, to Andreas' I think, eloquent introduction to this conversation. To go back to that moment of the summer of 2020 seems so useful and helpful and clarifying, right? That was a moment when it became clear, and this goes back, I think, also to Dennis' question about sort of messages that can travel across the Atlantic here and there, right? You know, the politics of the United States are terrible. Nothing could be worse. It's a misery moment by moment, with each hour worse than the last, and humiliating and so on. But, you know, one interesting thing happened, which is that the United States really clarified the choice, right? There were two liberatory politics on offer. And one was working through the state, through the DSA, through the left wing of the Democratic Party, to elect someone like Sanders, or, you know, one of Sanders' inheritors who will come along. And that was one course. And then there was the course, and we'll call that the party course. And then there was what we'll call the Minneapolis course, right? The politics of Minneapolis, the politics of Portland, the politics of Kenosha, the politics of a national proletarian, Black-led uprising of unprecedented intensity and scale. And I think it would be optimistic to say, like, oh, between the two of those things matters look great on the left. I don't want to suggest they're the same. I want to suggest that there are options that have been set forth for us to think about how we might proceed. And I found one of them far more persuasive, not in its ethical demand, although that's powerful, but in its apparent capacity to compel transformation. So I think that we successfully put the choices on offer, and I think the choice is clear. So that's sort of where I end up on those questions. I think there's much more to say, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Oh, excellent. Many thanks. Now, would you directly respond to that, Andreas?
Yeah,
Are
may
you
I?
interested in going on with that?
Yeah, may I respond briefly?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So on the question of Lenin, and I can't resist the temptation to reflect on this. So of course, Joshua is perfectly right that Lenin envisioned socialism as an increasing abundance of material goods, starting with electrification. And this was the general Marxist model, right, for how a revolution would occur. It would occur in a highly developed society with a lot of productive forces, straining against the fetters of capitalist relations. And once those fetters had been burst, the productive forces would develop in an unlimited fashion. And throughout the 20th century, the Russian Revolution was perceived as a deviation from this model, because the Russian Revolution happened not only in a poor, underdeveloped country, but in a situation of societal collapse and ruin. I mean, the Bolsheviks had to try to rule a wasteland where everything was falling apart, and where there was no energy to be had, or at least not any fossil energy. I mean, all the coal, all the oil was gone from the hands of the Bolsheviks in the early part of the revolution. Now, the problem was that Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they had to deal with that. They had to improvise, and they had to do the best they could with a society falling apart. It's a kind of post-apocalyptic situation, really, and therefore build what they called war communism temporarily. But ever since, as I said, the traditional interpretation of this period was that that's not how a socialist revolution or transition is going to happen. But I think that we can now see, and this ties in with part of what Joshua said, that the future is exactly precisely that. The Russian Revolution was not the exception. It's going to be the rule for how we get out of capitalism. We are going to have to rule more over wastelands than over paradises. So we're going to face more in the way of shortages and less in the way of abundance due to the ecological crisis. And this is one of the points with introducing the concept of ecological war communism, partly in an implicit, perhaps somewhat explicit also at points, disagreement with the idea of fully automated luxury communism, which has become a very popular way of talking about communism in recent years, which has as its premise extreme supply, that we will have extreme supply of everything. And I think it will be the other way around. We will face shortages of goods. And when we think about communism as a society where we don't have classes, but where everyone's basic needs are fulfilled, we need to think, how do we build this communism in a society where we face shortages rather than extreme supply? So the point here is the Bolshevik experience was not a deviation from the model. It was far more than the Bolsheviks themselves understood the future, insofar as we're going to rule over societies that, to some extent at least, might very well fall apart. I'm here obviously very much aligned to the Salvage Journal and the Salvage Collective and their visions of what they call salvage communism, but that's another matter. Now, let me just also say that I think had Sanders and Corbyn won, the problem would have been that all the capitalist constraints would then have been in place. Yes, of course. But I think that the left in the UK and the US that built up the movements behind those two projects were perfectly aware that if they were going to win, that would be the moment when the social struggle starts for real. I don't think anyone on the left in those countries had the illusion that these wins would by themselves shatter the capitalist constraints. But I think that we need to think about those, the processes that major election wins can potentially unleash if they go hand in hand with social struggles outside of parliament, might start to press against those constraints. And if circumstances are auspicious, and if there is a leadership that doesn't back off from the confrontation, as the Syriza leadership did, for instance, you can potentially transcend those constraints. So yes, the constraints would have been there, but an election wins can capitalists can trigger processes that might go beyond them. One final thing. When it comes to considering the role of the state versus the role of the climate movement in the transition away from fossil fuels, my basic point here is that if we're going to have to see emissions cuts on the order of 5 to 7 to 10% per year in countries in the global north, and if we're going to shut down all fossil fuel production as fast as possible within years or decades, can we really conceivably envision a situation where we, as in the climate movement, riots, communes, execute that program? Or isn't it necessary for states to do it in a central and coordinated and to some extent coercive fashion? Because what really needs to be done here is that you coerce certain types of capitalists to terminate their operations. And how do you do that without a state? Or if we do it, wouldn't we constitute ourselves as a state apparatus executing that kind of coercion?
In brief, I must say that seems to just involve assuming your conclusions, that no matter what you do, there's a state. That's true. There's certainly no room for discussion here if we simply assume our conclusions. But I'd rather we keep the possibility open for other possible conclusions, since then at least we might think about possibilities rather than having already conceded the fundamental ground in advance, which doesn't seem to me like a functional political strategy.
We have, I have a relatively individualized specific question for Joshua, and I think Ines has one more specific question for Andreas. But I also want to say regarding the tendency of questions in the chat, right? There are many questions about the commune form or forms of dual power in general, and then what the specific organizational form and differences with regard to the commune model would amount to, in Joshua's view. For instance, people are asking about the threat of some kind of green nationalism, or as some people refer to it, climate leviathan, but also the threat of proper fascist reaction, what gets called eco-fascism and so forth. Those are some of the things being asked in the chat. People are asking about the role of unions also. Other people are focused on sort of activist discussions within the movement. And then we have one more thing we have is questions about the role of media and the use of non-corporate media and so forth, right? To catalyze a movement, to organize people outside of the dominant channels. I just want to say that. Now, but I think we could have those two more questions, if that's okay, and then open up the discussion again. Would that be okay? Yeah, okay, I take that as a yes. Now, okay, I have a question for Joshua, which is basically asking you once again, Joshua, if you would mind unpacking a notion that you use in the book, the notion of the production of non-production. Touched upon that already, of course, but maybe you can explicate that a little bit for us, as you use it also in your Riot, Strike, Riot book to describe the crisis tendency of capital since the 1970s. And in relation to that, then how exactly do we get from Marx's so-called general law of accumulation to a Fanonian notion, and you both mention him, right, in your recent books, the Fanonian notion of a capitalism compelled to act as colonial, which is what you developed, right, as an argument, Joshua, and which then fails to absorb substantial parts of the global proletariat, right, into the economy. Would it be correct to say that this is also what your argument about the intransigent social centrality of Riot and other forms of circulation struggles, which are maybe less spectacular than the Riot, but also forms of circulation struggles, essentially, that it rests on that fundamentally, that is sort of the core argument, or is that a simplification of what you develop in the book?
I'm not sure it's a simplification. It may be a sophisticated version. I tried to keep the book as simple as I could. But I'll try and answer that and not try to go on too long. And I think this connects to what I tried to say at the opening in my efforts to understand political violence, not from the context of whether it's desirable or not, or whether it might be successful or not, but the reasons that it takes certain forms at certain historical moments, right? The reason that sort of political struggle was oriented by the strike in the West for a very long time, and then it didn't go away, of course, but the labor movement has waned dramatically by all measures. Not gone away, but waned dramatically. And things like riots and blockades and so on and so forth, which were always with us, have become more and more present and arguably powerful. And the question is why? Not is that good or is that bad, although that's a question we can ask, but why is always my simple question. So the concept of the production of non-production is a little bit of a sort of inverted reading of Marx. I think it's in Marx, but we mostly think of Marx as talking about production itself. He's fascinated with capitalist production, the production of goods, but most importantly, the production for capitalists of surplus value and profit and so on. And the question, one of the questions he asks as a logical and historical matter is how this unfolds over time. And so that, what the capitalist does, right? This is very intro. I apologize to everyone for this sort of intro speak, but right, the capitalist uses their capital to bring together labor and means of production. So let's say a worker in a factory. And I don't mean by that to focus only on waged workers. There's all kinds of people who do all kinds of work that makes capitalism reproducible. And I don't want to exclude anyone from that. But for the moment, let's say that the capitalist invests capital to bring together workers and factories, and then they produce whatever the fuck they want, cars or widgets or computers, and sell them for a profit, and the capitalists don't care as long as it's a profit. So over time, and this is the entirety of what Capital Volume 1 is about. Over time, this has certain tendencies within it. Capitalists have to compete with each other in their production of surplus value. And the main form of their competition is by cheapening their processes, particularly by decreasing the amount of money they spend on labor, variable capital, Marx calls it, by becoming more and more productive, getting more and more productive processes. And this is central to much of what Andreas has written about, right? Because developing the use of various kinds of power in the literal sense, right? Energetics, steam and fossil fuels and so on is vital to this increasing productivity, where it takes less work per machine to make the widget. Over time, right, this develops in all kinds of ways, but this increasing productivity eventually means you're so productive you just don't need that many workers to produce the widgets. But it also means that economies enter into crisis, and I can't do all of crisis theory here. I'm happy to Zoom with people later if we wanted to have a crisis theory working group. It won't be my first or my last, probably. But over time, you get these moments of crisis that we've all experienced. We're in one of them now, in fact, where this particular process suddenly can't reproduce itself and goes into, some people call it a financial crisis. That's often a misnomer, right? But there's this moment when suddenly there's no good reason for the car maker to make cars because they can't sell cars at a profit. And so they stop. The factory stops. It stops making cars because there's no reason to run it if it's not going to sell cars at a profit. The factory stops making cars, the capitalist stops investing, and the workers stop working because it's shut down. So those are all forms of capacity, right? Labor is a capacity, a productive capacity. The factory is a productive capacity, and capital is a productive capacity. But the nature of capitalism is it eventually means that all of those capacities go unused, right? And that's what a crisis is, it's unused capacity. So you have unemployed people, unused factories, and capital just sitting around or sloshing through banks and in circuits of finance. So all of those things which were meant to be productive are suddenly non-productive, right? And capitalism produces this itself. It produces this excess capacity, and so this non-production, empty factories and surplus population. And I think that's the situation we increasingly find ourselves in, right? At a global level, Mike Davis's book, Planet of Slums, is sort of inarguable about this, about the global production of non-production, of people who can't work productively. That's not an evaluation of them as humans. That means they can't produce profits for capitalism. And so capitalism has no use for them. So this production of surplus population, that's the condition in which we operate, right? That's one of the constraints in which we think about political trajectories, political tactics, political strategies, which is why we start to see tactics that don't require you to be in an organized workplace, don't require you to be a laborer, but which are available to people who've been rendered surplus by the population or been excluded from the wage, excluded from the workplace, and have these available political strategies, of which the riot is an obvious, spectacular example. And blowing up pipelines, to get back where we stopped, is another example, right? Because as I noted, you don't have to be a worker, right? To down tools, you have to be a worker, but to blow up a pipeline, you don't. And so these strategies that are available to people excluded from the formal wage are increasingly the kind of strategies we see, which is why I think that Andreas and I's forecast of what kinds of tactics we're likely to see converges, even if our visions of how that might unfold toward emancipation, I think, diverge a bit. But our sense of like what's going to happen and how it's going to how people are going to act to free themselves, I think we're very much in the same place.
Either Andreas directly in response to that or waiting for Ines' question.
Let me just say very briefly that I completely agree here with Joshua, and I have to say that the idea of having blockades and other kinds of militant mass action against fossil fuel infrastructure fits very well into the analytical schema that Joshua has developed in his book. I saw here in the chat, and I hope we get a chance to bring in more questions from the audience soon, but I saw someone asking about Ende Gelände, and really, I mean, in my book, I kind of promote Ende Gelände as really the best that the climate movement in the global north has come up with, or rather I should say Europe, because I focus on the climate movement in Europe, which is where I live. So I don't deal very much with what's been happening in the US and Canada. But Ende Gelände has been the most radical and in some senses the most successful wing of the climate movement in Europe. And it has operated precisely in the fashion that Joshua outlines in his book. It has involved people who are workers, but but not necessarily as workers in a workplace. And the point that Joshua made early on that I can blow up a pipeline just as well as the BP employee. That's precisely how the lignite mine shutdowns work as well. That everyone can go and shut down the pipelines. And these are, people who come from all walks of life. Clearly, I don't have any sociological data on what kind of people go to climate camps, but it seems to fit with the idea that these are, broadly people that are without property, dispossessed people, or people who are not part of the dominant classes that can go and establish a camp like that and conduct this kind of actions. And there are all sorts of ideas about how to escalate this struggle. And I don't want anyone to think that I am arguing that the one sole thing that should be done is to blow up pipelines or something like that. I think, there are ideas. So Tadjo Müller, for instance, a person who quite a few of you will know, he has been arguing recently that the way forward is to try to combine Ende Gelände type blockades with XR tactics in more urban areas and go after important nodal points in the logistics of the fossil fuel infrastructure. This would, of course, also be completely in line with Joshua's strategic ideas. I'm just for experimenting with all of this, and we should try. We should expand our idea of what climate activism is and what it can look like. There was also a question about, but yeah, we can come back to that.
Yeah, I think you have covered now the question on the diversity of tactics. So you say that there is a diversity and this is not a bad thing. But I wanted to take up on the question that was also in the chat and then that I had prepared too, was that there is this saying by Rosa Luxemburg that was mentioned in the chat, that there's always kind of a reactionary response if you only have like half measures, if you don't really have this kind of revolutionary moment or it passes by, then there is a reactionary response to it maybe. And it could be either, I think, bourgeois authoritarian in a sense that we have kind of green capitalist scenario where everything just slows down a bit, but nothing changes that much. But then we also had in the chat the possibility of some kind of eco-fascism or an eco-fascist regime, which I know, Andreas, you're an expert of, and you're going to publish a book with the Clara Zetkin collective just on this. And I think you could talk a little bit about this, possibility, and also how to react to it from a strategic point of view from the left. I mean, is it like around the corner, or what do you think is what is a threat?
Yeah. Okay. So these two brief books, the short books that I've written and that came out recently are not based on any research, but the one that we're about to publish in May in English is based on a lot of collective research. So we're 20 people that have done research on what the far right has said and done about climate and energy in 13 European countries and the US and Brazil. And one of our main findings is that green nationalism, or in its more radical form, eco-fascism, is still the minority position within the far right. And it's completely absent from the Brazilian far right, and it's a fringe phenomenon on the US far right. The most common position is still denial of the problem and absolute chauvinism about fossil fuel production and consumption. That's the AFD line. That's the line of the Sweden Democrats that we'll have sitting in the government in Sweden most likely after the next election, and that's still the most common line. Then you have certain actors on the far right that opt for something like green nationalism, and it's a much more common position in France. But you will also find it. I mean, there are people on the German far right, Björn Höcke and others, who are dabbling in this area. You will find it on the Finnish far right. You will find it with people like Brendan Tarrant, who conducted the massacre in Christchurch and stuff like that. But I think we'll see more of that on the far right, but I don't think that we will see the anti-climate politics of the far right disappearing. And my analysis is that green nationalism is actually just another form of anti-climate politics, because what it's really all about is killing Muslims or attacking immigrants in another form. And you won't solve any kind of ecological problem by killing Muslims in a mosque or sending immigrants home. So it's just another diversionary tactics away from a confrontation with fossil capital. But I don't think that we can safely predict an end to climate denial and all-out pro-fossil fuel fascism. That's still a very likely development, precisely because when you start challenging the interests and privileges of fossil capital for real, you will trigger a backlash. And the far right is the force of that backlash, and it's in its most aggressive form. And there's no way of wishing that confrontation away. If we want a rapid and radical transition away from fossil fuels, we have to antagonize those people who are beholden to those interests and privileges. The question is, how do we succeed in that confrontation, not how do we avoid it? And well, if I understand your question right, you could of course pose the question: will more militant tactics not help the far right in demonizing the climate movement and feed into their agenda and things like that? Yeah, possibly. But and here maybe I disagree with Joshua. I think the point about inviting an element of violence and militancy in the climate movement is not to unleash those forces without any kind of control, but I think that we need to be smart and limited and have certain rules in place for how to conduct more militant activities in the climate movement, and for instance not go after things like the subway in London, which the XR did in their infamous action, or attack properties and consumption goods that belong to ordinary working people. That, I mean, you can shoot yourself in the foot and give the enemy a lot of ammunition if you're doing unintelligent sabotage or militant action, and it's important to avoid that. I don't say if I had a recipe for how to defeat the far right, I would be happy to share it, but I don't have that recipe. And we don't have any recipe of that sort in our book. But in our book, I think we try to understand how racism and fossil fuels have become so deeply entangled in modern history, and more specifically contemporary history in the past decade, and extrapolate these trends and see where they could potentially lead us, and warn against any dalliance whatsoever with green nationalist rhetoric in the climate movement, and be absolutely uncompromising on never yielding anything to that kind of rhetoric about overpopulation in the global south, about immigration as a problem for the environment, and stuff like that. But I can't say that I know how we win that struggle. I just think that we really need to be in that struggle and not back off from it.
I think that's important, and I agree with essentially every word of that. I think it's exactly in this question, right, that we see if we focus too much on one or the other of either climate struggles or what I'm calling end of growth, we lose track of things. So Andreas is right, like that if you're just asking the fascists to be identified correctly as to whether they conceptualize climate as a problem they're trying to control, or whether they deny it, or like you don't see the picture that's happening. But if you look at this combined struggle, I mean, if there's anything I learned from Andreas early on, it's right that when we think about immigration now, we're already talking about climate immigration and climate struggles, right? And so the various transformations that are happening, in Europe is as good an example as any, around what I have taken to calling sort of fortress leftism, which is nominally left parties demanding closed borders, intense policing of immigration, and so on and so forth, which takes a logic immediately of, it's an end of growth logic, right? That there's a limited supply of jobs, we can't internalize more labor inputs, we have to close those borders to keep immigrants out so that there's, German jobs for Germans or whatever it is. But at the same time, that's always also a climate logic. It's always also a maintenance and control over resources. And so even if it doesn't explicitly formulate itself as a climate nationalism, or as a climate fascism, it is inevitably entangled with that. It's the logic of resource protection cuts across and the national character of it, and thus often the racial character of it, cuts across the questions of end of growth and climate collapse, and they're always both present. And so co-thinking them seems like the obligation that we have as people who are trying to find a way out.
Right now, Ines, what do you think? Should we begin to take on questions from the chat?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, there were so many questions, and some have now been answered. But I mean, I know that Joshua wanted to talk about the political organization question. There were many questions about how you then view what kind of political organization is then suitable to that kind of strategy. But then also lots of questions about indigenous riots that you also wanted to take up on. And yeah, I would like to invite you to do that. If it's together, I mean, tell me if it's too much for one question.
Oh yes, but I want to second this. And so many people have been asking about not just Ende Gelände, but also Idle No More and the protests against the Great North Dakota Access Pipeline. Mm-hmm. And they want to hear about that a little bit, if possible.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
And Isolde is telling us that she's collapsing out now. So I think we have to deal with that. Speak slowly for the Germans, maybe.
Okay, I'll do my best. I'm glad that we can take a moment to talk about indigenous struggles in North America, since I think they're a complement to, among other things, the Ende struggle in Germany. In North America, the tradition of pipeline blockades and other forms of sabotage, but most notably blockades, is in many ways an indigenous tradition, right? The tradition of a particular relationship of kinship to the land, and thus of being water protectors, land defenders. This is an indigenous tradition. I've learned much about this from people like Nick Estes and Glenn Coulthard and various other people. And I think it points to some important features that are worth dwelling on for a moment. So Andreas has raised the vital question of what distinguishes climate movements from the George Floyd uprising is that there's no clear sort of moment of precipitation, right? There's no 8-minute video and sort of focused outrage of the repeated violent destruction, murder, subordination. It's mediated at a distance and seems impersonal. But when we think about, for example, the Standing Rock uprising, right, which is in many ways like follows on Idle No More. It's neither the first nor the last of pipeline blockades, but it's a dramatic social movement. And I think arguably the most important social movement in North America alongside the George Floyd uprising for various reasons, in part because it makes climate part of its fundamental claim, but not its only claim, right? It matters that there's a history there of sovereignty struggles, of land dispossession, in which a lot of indigenous struggle is based, right? So if you can combine a contestation about land dispossession and people's displacement from the land with climate defense, you have the possibility for a more powerful integrated movement that does sort of take off, at least for a time being, until extraordinary repressive measures are applied. That sort of takes off in a way that I think gives me a little bit of hope. And moreover, I think that what happens there and in other blockades is a really useful schema for thinking about struggle in general. So I really want to focus on the pipeline blockade for just a moment in thinking about organization. So I talked before, and it's sort of what I work through in Riot, Strike, Riot, of the pairing, the dialectic, if you will, of production and circulation as the two moments of capitalist reproduction. But of course, that doesn't capture all of human activity. Even if we stay in a fairly simple schema, there's production, there's circulation, and then there's reproduction, right? Reproductive labor, often feminized, but not intrinsic to its nature, which doesn't just include biological reproduction, but other kinds of reproduction, including reproducing a workforce, right? It's not noble or honorable to reproduce a workforce, but it's something we have to do. And moreover, how we reproduce ourselves as communities is going to be a necessary feature of some kind of life outside of capitalism. And I deeply believe that there's no survival for any of us, human and otherwise, except outside of capitalism, and that has to happen pretty quickly. So we have to be thinking about this question of how we reproduce ourselves outside of capitalism without reference to buying things in the market, without reference to earning a wage. And if we don't think about that, we're all dead. And when we think about the blockade, we see that that's one of the questions that's getting raised, right? Because people have to figure out how to organize that community to make it persist, because a blockade only matters if it lasts day after day, week after week, month after month. So that community that is the blockade has to figure out how to reproduce itself. So that's what I call a commune, right? I don't mean it has to look like, communes don't have to look like Paris in 1871, nor do they have to look like Morelos in 1911 or Shanghai in 1927. They look like a community figuring out how to reproduce itself without reference to capitalism. And you have to do that to make a blockade work. You're still within capitalism, it doesn't magically leave it, but it's one of the puzzles, right? Is communal reproduction. At the same time, it's a circulation struggle, right? It blocks the circulation of fossil fuels and blocks the circulation of capital itself, right, in doing that. So it's simultaneously a reproduction struggle and a circulation struggle. It's a commune and a riot at the same time, if you will, that's sustained over time. I think that's a remarkable feature, and also has the feature of overcoming the seeming opposition between, on the one hand, like we must engage in care and be peaceful and caring. And on the other hand, we must be militant and blockade. It turns out it's the same thing, right? Because people care for each other in that communal form, they can blockade capital. It's the same single unitary act. And I think I see that as a way forward, right? I see that as the political form, which is not just a circulation struggle, like a riot, not just a production struggle, like a strike, but has the features of being a circulation struggle, which, as we know, has come to the fore for material reasons, and a reproduction struggle, the beginning of a commune. And so I think that's the organizational form that Standing Rock directs us toward, that Ende Gelände directs us toward, that all of these efforts direct us toward. That, again, when I see the possibility for a way out, I think I see some of it there. So I think looking at indigenous struggles in North America, I think I take from that a series of revolutionary lessons about survival.
Wonderful, many thanks, Joshua. We have more. There was also many. We have many questions in the chat, but many have also been answered already. So, would you rather respond to that, Andreas, to what Joshua just presented regarding the commune form, struggles across these spheres, and struggles for reproduction outside of capital, or take on a specific question from the chat, or Ines?
I don't have any objections to what Joshua just said. It's a compelling vision, and I agree basically with everything.
Okay.
So let's take more from the chat.
Okay, let's take more from the chat then. Joshua, you were raising your hand. Were you?
No, I was just giving a thumbs up approval to take questions from the chat.
Okay, excellent. So let me read a question from the chat. Here is one. For instance, to Joshua, how could we understand ecological struggle in your framework? Ecology seems to touch a question that extrapolates the scheme production circulation. It is not a struggle on work conditions or public transportation, gas taxes, for instance, because it is about life itself and the non-human world, the very condition of humanity. At the same time, the effects of ecological catastrophe will be felt more intensively by the superfluous and racialized populations.
I think I just answered that, or at least I meant to, which is to say, I agree, right, that right, we don't, when I talk about circulation struggles, I don't want it to be reduced simply to transport, right? It often gets discussed that way, and for good reason, right, because the transport of commodities has become more and more important to capital, and more the development of logistics chains around the globe and so on. But when I talk about circulation struggles, I mean struggles by people who've been pushed into the space of circulation, which is to say the space of the market, but not the space of the wage. So they're still having to survive by buying goods at the store or the market, but they don't have direct access to the wage. And that's the first condition of a circulation struggle. Is it's a struggle, right? People fight where they are. That's the one thing we know. And if people are pushed out of the wage, but are still in the market, that's where they're going to fight. If people are pushed off their land, that's where they're going to fight. So circulation struggles include things for me like blockades, occupations, gatherings in public squares, all the things that happen in the space of the market, the agora, public space, as opposed to the space of the factory, the workplace, and so on. So it's absolutely the case that for me, that ecological struggles often take the form, like our circulation struggles, not because climate collapse is not the same as commodity transport, which is clearly true, but because the people who engage in climate struggle are often going to be people for whom the question is not their working conditions, but they're living survival conditions, their subsistence conditions. And again, when I think about land defenders and water defenders, this seems to make sense within that framework. So I absolutely agree that there's a coming together of the people who are most affected by climate devastation and the people who are most likely to fight it. And that's good news, right? The fact that those two categories turn out to be the same category and converge, that's how politics works. The people who are most affected by a problem are the people who are most likely to fight it. So in that sense, there's some hope.
Yeah, I just promised in the chat that I would take up on, or I would summarize some of the questions so we don't have like masses. I mean, summarizing in a sense that I hope they make sense together, because many people asked about what kind of new literature do we need, what kind of new propaganda, non-corporate media. And I mean, since I'm doing a socialist magazine, I know how important it is to have a different kind of narrative, and people are asking like, what kind of new narrative do we need? How do we shape new propaganda for this cause? I mean, this is a huge question, obviously, and you and our media experts, I guess, but maybe, and well, I mean, many people were interested in what kind of new great narrative do we need this one? Or how do we transport the message so that we mobilize a majority, which I guess we need? To both of you, if you have any ideas.
I mean, I'll say something brief. I'm probably the greatest skeptic about the power of media. Not that I think it's not powerful, but I tend to think that, that our actions lead and representations of them follow. And I don't have the faith that I once had, to be honest, in that one can produce compelling and persuasive literature that moves people to action. I tend to think people get moved more by their own conditions. That said, I want to go back to the very beginning of our conversation this evening, where Andreas spoke about the way that the George Floyd uprising disproved various claims about the need for pacifism to get people to join a movement. That's correct, right? And that's a media story, among other things. It was, in the classic sense, a charismatic action. Right? It was an action people did that was disseminated by quite hostile media. The media coverage of that, believe me, I was here. The media coverage of that was relentlessly hostile, and yet it was disseminated and so charismatic that people joined in and got with it. So in that sense, yes, it matters what you do. It matters that people know you're doing it. It matters that that message gets carried. I think focusing too much on developing a sympathetic media rather than doing the actions is maybe not the best way to devote one's energies, although I understand why people would want to do that. But I think the charismatic action is its own media and will circulate. And as Andreas noted, it works.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, I mean, at some point, this becomes inevitably a discussion about social media and about the left in the new media reality that digital technologies have created. And I'm by temperament and a little bit by intellect as well, a Luddite on these questions. So I tend to be fairly hostile to social media. And actually believe that it has done more harm than good to the left and more good than harm to the far right so far, and that we need to think about how we organize beyond and perhaps not without social media, but in forms that shed some of the extreme evanescence of the social media technology or the social media and digital technologies. And what I mean by this is that social media and digital technologies do not seem to be conducive to solid organizational projects, but to what I think actually is a bane of our time, which is the sudden eruption and disappearance of movements. They come and go like tweets. Obviously, you can argue against this by saying that social media played a very positive role in the George Floyd uprising, and it did. It played a positive role in other uprisings of the past decade. But there is something extremely constraining about the politics that comes out of social media, and that it doesn't build lasting formations, which I think we really do need. Clearly, we can't opt out of it, and we have to tell our stories through the media channels that do exist. But I mean, I imagine someone could write a Leninist critique of social media and apply some of his frustration with the evanescence of politics in the late Tsarist empire to the current situation, mutatis mutandis. I mean, it's obviously extremely different. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I don't know if it makes sense.
Agree completely.
Thank you so much. I have one, I think, already final question from the chat. My apologies to everybody, right, who wrote questions in the chat. I hope many of them were answered. And also greetings to, or many thanks to Isolde, our translator. She had to stop at some point. She did wonderful work, amazing. And maybe there will be subtitles maybe for the YouTube version. But here's the question. I mean, there have been questions about Andreas's Leninism, right? What kind of exactly? And also questions regarding his apparent agnosticism. Just citing one interview with Aufhe Banga, where he called himself an agnostic in regard to nuclear. But I really don't think we have the time to go there now, although it is an important question, clearly. So many thanks. But the actual final question is, I'm sorry for being the one responsible for that, is, well, what is your sexy counterclaim, both of you, right, to Mark Fisher's notion of red plenty or the luxury communism thesis from a standpoint of the condition of capitalism's non-reproduction? So there apparently some people really seem to care about the promise, right, of plenty, of luxury communism. So what's your response to that?
Yeah. So let me just say that the struggle for survival will be key in the coming decades, but we can't just offer people survival. And my little rant about war communism earlier on may have left you with that impression that it's only about surviving. I actually think that there is still space for telling people that lives will be improved by the transition away from the fossil economy. And I think this is one of the really important things with the G&D framework, that you can actually offer people a vision of material betterment, not necessarily as in having access to more certain kinds of commodities, and people will have to fly less, whatever class they come from, and things like that. But people can work less and have better works, better jobs, and safer jobs, and all sorts of I mean, the climate movement has spent a lot of time, and its intellectuals, on outlining this kind of vision, this kind of future. And I think there is a lot of stuff there that's worth continuing to work with and try to bring to people, so that we don't only have the negative vision of avoiding death. I mean, that's going to be crucial, but the way to avoid death is to also make the lives of working people and people who can't work better. That doesn't mean luxury in the sense that it's in the way that it's envisioned by the folk people, I think, as in extreme abundance of all sorts of goods and asteroid mining and these kind of techno utopias. But it does mean that the only way not to die is to make the lives of the majority of people better. And that, I think, it begins with working less for the people who have jobs.
Yeah. So first of all, again, I'm very happy after this long passage with everyone that Andreas and I are going to end up mostly in agreement. Working less is where it begins. I guess I also want to think about who's addressed by sort of this puzzle, right? Of like, how do you make a persuasive case for life being better? Or, that imagines a person who already has a fairly high standard of living, you know, who might have to give up their Subaru. And you know, you say to that person, well, how do you persuade them to give up their Subaru in return for saving the climate? What's the trade-off? That may be a question that people feel like they have to have. If they have neighbors with Subarus and have to talk to them, then you have to have that conversation, right? But I guess I just don't think of that person in the wealthy nations as necessarily the addressee of this question, right? If you say like, how do you make ecological struggle sexy for people in Haiti or people in the Niger River Delta? That's a trivial question. These are people who's like, when I think of material conditions in political struggle, I think of people who've been pushed by the world that we have, extractive, capitalist, colonizing domination, right, into lives of absolute misery, into lives of exclusion and total precarity. And, you know, the task is not to present those people with a sexy vision. The task is to figure out how those people, like, how you can get the fuck out of the way, let those people lead, stand with their movements, support them, right? And they don't need the sexy vision. And it's not our job as a sort of propagandists of the Rev to produce that. It's to think about what is going to help with that degree of misery to transform it and to make survival possible. And I want to hover on that and not worry too much about my neighbor with a Subaru.
Well, that's a great final remark, I guess, which we can all agree on, even though there was not only agreement today. I mean, there was a little bit disagreement on political strategy and also like the role of the state. So I don't want to end too much of harmony here, even though I think we agree on the last sentence that Joshua just said. But Andreas, you wanted to take over?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that was actually posted in the chat, and that's regarding diversity of tactics and disagreement with certain actions. I mean, the question was posed to me, and it was like, you say that the mainstream. Well, no, let's forget about that. But the point was that there is an older understanding of the concept of diversity of tactics, which says that you shouldn't criticize anyone else's tactics because we have diversity. I mean, this, you know, people who were around during the anti-globalization movement will remember these discussions around Genoa and elsewhere, that you shouldn't criticize the Black Bloc for what it's doing because it's a diversity of tactics in the movement. Everyone does what they want. And that's how we have to accept it. But my idea of diversity of tactics is not that. I think we have to be frank in criticizing each other when we think that that mistakes are made. So, for instance, a diversity of tactics approach would never lead me to abstain from criticizing XR for attacking working class commuters trying to get on their subway in London as they did last year. Likewise, the kind of diversity that we've had on show today between a sort of trot and a left communist position, I guess, I mean, let's not try to conceal that kind of diversity, but embrace it. And likewise, when the climate movement moves forward, there needs to be, I mean, we need to be critical of each other and what we're doing. And the point should not be that let everyone do whatever they want and go blow up a pipeline or assassinate an executive, do anything. That's not a productive way of thinking about activism, I think. Yeah, so I mean, ruthless criticism of all that exists, but also of what we're trying to do to change what exists. I think that's the Marxist way to go about it.
Hell yeah. So thank you so much.